July 9th, 1994, Saturday. It occurs to me that as we're working towards the unified field theory, we have a description in our model. What makes it unified is that it describes the way linearity relates to relativity. Relativity, being holistic in nature, has no linear connection with anything because everything is holistically connected, whereas in linearity there is no relative nature, and the closest you can get is non-linearity, which creates fractals. When you get fractals, that's when you're coming from linearity and creating space. When you're trying to reach linearity from relativity, from the holism, you create frictals, which are the dynamic record of the interaction of order and chaos. In effect, what it's saying is that space and time, neither of those actually exist in the universe external. The universe external only has mass and energy, and when you look at it from a linear side, you can say that that mass and energy then is turned into an appreciation, a perception that we call space and time, through a linear process that generates those two nonlinear and relativistic appreciations of space and time. But they can both be created out of linearity, requiring that there be no existing space nor existing time in the external universe. Only mass and energy and the interactions between the two create a linearity that generates the nonlinear and the relativistic. When you look at it from the other side, from the internal perspective, you look at the mind per se and say that only space and time exists. There is no such thing as mass and energy, discounting the entire external universe itself. The way that our appreciation of what is mass and what is energy, that there are such things and that they are external to ourselves, is a natural process by the interaction of space and time. And when we take the space and the time through the relativistic, the interaction of the relativistic with the nonlinear, we end up creating an approximation of linearity, which requires both the point and the vector, and that is what creates the appreciation of mass and energy external to ourselves. So through that notion, clearly it can be seen that from the perspective of the mind, only the mind exists and the universe is a fabrication. From the perspective of the universe, only the universe exists and the mind is a fabrication, which leads to the Taoist philosophy of all being nothing and nothing being all. It also leads to the concept of particle and wave, because it means that we see something that exists that is a true paradox. From one perspective, the second one doesn't exist. When we go to the second one and adopt that perspective, the first one doesn't exist. That is one of those strange mathematical phenomena, strange loops, which is making its way into loop theory and string theory and chaos theory. And in fact, as long as we try to resolve the strange loop, we're missing the point. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. As soon as we define something, we have actually missed describing what it really is, because we cannot describe the paradox as not existing. And so what we need to do is describe the paradox in terms of paradox, to allow for paradox, which is what current mathematical thinking does not allow for. That's why when we have inverse functions in trigonometry, we limit them to one cycle so they won't violate the definition of a function. We must violate the definition of a function in order to have a viable system that describes both sides. In fact, from a mental perspective, there can be no such thing as a particle and no such thing as a wave. There has to be something inside, internal, that generates a view as a particle when seen from our spatial perspective and as a wave when seen from our temporal perspective. The particle would be the mass and the wave would be the energy. What we have created in mental relativity is such a model, whereby we cannot hold all of it in our minds at a single time. It is impossible. And when we hold as much as we can from a spatial perspective, we see it as a structure and we see particles. When we hold as much as we can from a temporal perspective, we see energy and we see waves. So in fact, we do not have any energy or any mass that exists in the model of mental relativity, only an appreciation we call energy and appreciation we call mass when we look at it from one side or the other. But the paradox itself is now created in our model. That paradox is the internal equivalent of the external concept we call a photon. Externally, a photon is the only object we see both as being a particle and a wave. In fact, it is not a particle and a wave. It is seen as a particle or a wave, but the reality of it is neither particle nor wave, but something else of which one spatial slice looks like particles and one temporal slice looks like waves. The photon is a quantum. Inside the mind, we have the equivalent of the quantum, which we call a qualum. And a qualum, as opposed to being a quivering mass of probability externally, is a quivering mass of potentiality inside. We're dealing with the process equivalence of external quantum theory. And with quantum theory, we look at an object called the photon. The photon, then, is something that can neither be seen as space or as time. You can either see it as a structure or you can see it as a mechanism. But whether you're looking at it as state or process, you're really missing the boat because there's something inside that is generating both of those views, but is really neither of those views. So it is not that it is both space and time, but it is something else other than space and time sitting at the middle. And in fact, what it is mass energy. Just as externally we see energy and mass, and since space and time are created inside to project them externally, we create space-time as a space-time continuum. When we look inside and see the photon at work and see that it has a spatial side and a temporal side, then we have to blend mass and energy and come up with mass energy, which is the existence internally of a constant. Space-time externally generates the constant of the speed of light, which is why we end up having E equals mc squared. We take that constant times itself rather than dividing it into the two halves of space and time and saying that it is really the spatial aspect of light times the temporal aspect of light, or wavelength times frequency, space times time. When we look at wavelength times frequency, because of the fact that two are blended together in the external universe, when one goes up, the other goes down, and in effect, we're just looking at the speed of light, regardless of how we measure it spatially or temporally, and square it. Internally, we end up with mass energy, where it doesn't really matter if we look at mass going up or energy going down. The two seem tied together. The reason they're tied together is because mass and energy generate dimensions. And the dimensions of the mind that we're talking about is how many different levels, fractal or frictal, we can contain in our minds at one time. All we can actually contain are three. That's why we see three dimensions, and the fourth dimension is one that we can only synthesize. That's the one that we stand on, and we're trying to figure out what it looks like under our feet when we look at the three dimensions externally. So inside, since the two are tied together in mass energy, the constant is not the speed of light externally, it is the size of mind. And as a demonstration of this, you can imagine losing track of the fourth thing after you've seen the third. These normal experiments where you look at how many things you can remember, 7 plus or minus 2 single items in short-term memory, according to psychology, is not dealing with a proper number of dimensions with the way dimensions really work. When we talk about creating a quad helix in mental relativity, as opposed to a double helix in DNA, where we're not talking about just having four things that exist at the same moment in space-time. We're talking about one thing that is applied to the next, then another is applied to the product of those two, and another is applied to the product of the third with the first two. So we end up with a progression where one thing is multiplied by another, is multiplied by another, is multiplied by another, and at the end we end up with our complete recursive cycle of going as far as we can before we have looped over the place we were in our original space-time externally, or mass energy internally. The way this works is by looking at a spiral. And to take a spiral and say, if we take the formula for a spiral, which is a third-dimensional appreciation that when seen from its end appears to be a circle and recursive, when seen from its side appears to be a sine wave and open. Therefore, it creates a particle from one view and a waveform from another. If we take this spiral and we look at it at a three-quarter angle, we can clearly see that it moves through an extra dimension that is not sufficient to describe it either as a particle or a wave. In fact, it is neither particle or wave, but it is something in between the two that generates those two perspectives. Now, if we take that as our essential concept of a spiral, and we take the formula for a spiral and multiply it by the formula for a spiral and multiply that by the formula for a spiral and multiply that by the formula for a spiral, we've gone through all four dimensions, and we end up with something at the end that looks like exactly what we started with at the beginning. In other words, we take a spiral, and while it's spiraling, we spiral the spiral. And then we spiral the spiral that spiraled, and then we spiral the spiral that spiraled that spiraled. Now we can only go through 3 dimensions of that we can follow. And the example is to look at a piece of rope. If we take fibers that are going to make twine, and we see the fibers as creating a spiral, we can clearly see them spiraling along the linearity of the twine. Then if we take that linearity of the string or twine we've created and actually coil it, we can see that there's a spiral moving around the twine. At the same time, we've created a coil, which is another spiral, so there's a spiral within the spiral. Then if we take that spiral we've made of a coil and stretch it out like a slinky, and then we spiral that entire slinky around, we can see that there's a spiral on the linearity of the twine, then a spiral that is created by coiling that linearity, and then a spiral when we wrap the entire coil in a spiral fashion. Now, if we try and move one farther dimension and take that coil that's moving in a spiral of the coil that was made of the twine that has a spiral going along its linearity and spiral that, we cannot hold all that in our minds at the same time. The minute we try to achieve an understanding of the larger spiral, we lose track of the lower spiral. As a result, we can only see 3 dimensions at once, not 4, and because of that, we have a 3-dimension bandwidth of the mind. In a sense, then that becomes the size of mind constant is 3 dimensions. And no matter how far we move up in our considerations to look at higher fractal levels or frictal levels, or no matter how far down we go to see greater detail, we cannot see any broader a scope than 3 dimensions of it at a time. But that little boxcar moves up and down the track of thought, describing the number of ties that our mind covers, which is 3 dimensions worth. But we can move up, we can move down, we can move to greater detail, we can move to a larger, broader perspective, but we'll never see more than 3 dimensions at the same time. And that is a psychological, not exactly a proof, but kind of a proof of concept of the size of mind as appearing to be a constant. Therefore, this would be true of those who are retarded as well as those who are geniuses. It really doesn't matter. You're still going to see 3 dimensions or you can't be self-aware. The real question is, how far can you move on the track upward, and how far can you move on the track downward before you lose track?